DSM-6 will be structured around biomarkers, despite acknowledgement there aren't any. By Peter Simons. Psychiatry is hard at work crafting the newest edition of its diagnostic Bible, DSM-6. The goal is to restructure the manual to facilitate precision psychiatry, a future in which psychiatry can identify the specific biology that causes mental illness, and thus dictate specific diagnoses and treatment unique to each individual. As such, the Biomarkers and Biological Factors Subcommittee was created to use biomarkers, biological signifiers tied to specific psychiatric diagnoses, to reorganize the whole project. The problem? They acknowledge that such biomarkers have not yet actually been found. Thanks for reading Mad in America. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work. The rationale, according to the committee, is that the new DSM's role will be to meaningfully change the way clinicians think. That is, clinicians who currently understand mental health problems to be caused by psychological, cultural, socioeconomic, and/or environmental factors, say trauma, must now come to understand mental health problems as diseases caused by biological differences, even though such differences have not been found. This shift is imperative, they write. The current DSM has been criticized for lack of validity, even by such luminaries as Thomas Insull and Alan Francis. But it skates by on the claim that it is just a dictionary of convenient labels, nothing more, although in practice it serves as the cultural touchstone to define and solidify the psychiatric model. This new approach, coming from the committee redesigning the DSM, cannot claim to be so agnostic. If the new DSM's explicit purpose is now to change the way clinicians think, so that they believe the biological model, instead of the psychosocial model, then it is no longer just a text of agreed-upon categories with unknown causes, but a statement of position. These illnesses are discrete, real, valid, because they are based on known biology, which psychiatry is responsible for identifying. So, what evidence is there to guide such a paradigm shift? Are there validated biomarkers that could be used to define these mental health conditions? No, according to the committee. That's why what they actually propose is to structure the DSM around candidate biomarkers. Biomarkers that have, as yet, failed to be validated. If they focused on only biomarkers that have actually been validated, then they could not rationalize making this change to the DSM. Including only validated biomarkers, as per FDA criteria, would be too limiting, since these exist only for Alzheimer's disease and opioid use disorder at this time, they write. And even these two examples are controversial, as the committee in the same article admits that they are not validated, but simply FDA approved. This FDA approval generated a robust and critical response from multiple experts in the field challenging the validity of the test. They write of the opioid use disorder biomarker, for example. Thus, even with FDA approval, the ultimate validity of this biomarker remains to be established. So what, then, are the proposed biomarkers around which they will restructure the DSM? They provide some discussion around this, but note that all may not currently meet the metrics required to be considered a biomarker. Of course, they do hold promise and reflect the state of the science. They write of potential clinically useful biomarkers, and how modern genetics promises to yield strong biomarkers that may enhance diagnostic accuracy, and that if robustly validated, these could be both diagnostic and treatment response biomarkers, and clinicians may be able to identify biologically distinct subtypes, and thus treatment may become more effective, emphasis mine. To translate, there are no existing clinically useful biomarkers. Modern genetics has not yet yielded useful biomarkers for any psychiatric diagnosis. There are currently no useful diagnostic or treatment response biomarkers. Clinicians cannot currently identify useful biological subtypes, and thus treatment cannot be personalized. The committee also acknowledges that these biomarkers, even if identified, may not help in any meaningful way, and indeed may harm. For instance, regarding an as-yet unvalidated difference in genetic risk, they write, particularly in mental illnesses, the polygenic risk score still has limited predictive power, may suffer from population bias, and may not add much more than already established risk factors, such as family history or influence of other social or environmental determinants. Additionally, over-reliance on PRS may inadvertently lead to stigma or health insurance discrimination for patients. Psychiatry has been attempting to define the biology of its disorders for a century. Yet each theory has been debunked in turn. Take the chemical imbalance, low serotonin theory of depression, for instance, an outdated idea from the 60s, propped up by pharmaceutical company ads, which has been debunked over and over. What if the previous editions of the DSM had been restructured around the serotonin theory? Where would that leave psychiatry's nosology, now that the theory has finally been abandoned? Of course, the previous DSM task forces also wanted to reorganize the manual around biology. However, they acknowledged that the lack of biomarkers meant they couldn't, in good conscience, do so. According to the DSM-6 committee, while DSM-5 did consider a more neurobiological approach, it was not adopted, reflecting the consensus that, with the recent exception of Alzheimer's disease, no biomarkers have had the needed specificity and sensitivity for use in routine psychiatric diagnosis, and that well-defined pathophysiological mechanisms for psychiatric disorders are lacking. The science has not changed, so how can the committee propose this for the DSM-6? The goal is simple, in their own words: restructure the DSM-6 around candidate biomarkers and use it to meaningfully change the way clinicians think. The purpose, then, of the new DSM is to convince clinicians and the public that unvalidated, hypothetical biological markers prove the validity of psychiatric diagnoses. Thanks for reading Mad in America. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.